So, looking at Book 5 of the Republic, I think we need to look back at Book 4. That was the most crucial thing, again, for this class, because that's where Plato outlines his theory of human nature. That theory of human nature is more or less what's here, that there are three parts of the soul, or individual self. I hope that I'm getting it fairly close to the text. There's different translations, but there is the rational part. Sorry. There is the spirited part, and there are, let's call it the appetitive part, or the desires. Socrates' basis for claiming that there are these three different parts of the individual self or soul is based upon his classes in his imaginary city: the guardians. Sorry, can't type. The auxiliaries and the moneymakers. I hope that that's the translation that this particular version of the Republic uses. The spirited part, or the rational part corresponds to the guardians, the spirited part to the auxiliaries, and the appetitive part of the desires to the moneymakers. So, really, what we find is that this whole enterprise of building this just city uh, has also been a way of developing a theory of human nature. And we saw also in Book 4 that he was interested, finally, he thought, since the city was done, that it was time to look for justice in the city, because after all, that's the point of building the city, is to find justice in it. And in a preliminary way, he goes through the other chief virtues of wisdom, courage, and moderation, or temperance, before he gets to justice. And he says that justice in the city is when each class is doing its own work, doing what it's supposed to do, keeping to its own, whereas injustice is doing the work of another. So the city is just when each class of people, the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the moneymakers, are doing what they're supposed to do. So, what are they supposed to do? Well, he's sort of set it up. What is justice in the city? Well, it's when each class is doing its work. But what is their work? Well, when the guardians rule, the auxiliaries carry out the orders of the guardians, and the moneymakers, the common people, obey that those orders or rules of the guardians. So, by analogy, what is justice in the individual soul? When the rational part, the thinking part, rules over the rest of the soul. The spirited part, or the willpower, really, carries out the orders of the rational part, and the desires, or the part that has appetites, the appetitive part, obeys. That's what Plato believes justice is, or Socrates says he believes that justice is in the individual. It's when each one of our parts is doing what it's supposed to do. And the crucial thing here, I think, is that he thinks of a human being as being made up of these three parts, but the most important really being the rational part, the thinking part, the intellect. And on the other side, the desires, the part that pursues pleasure, basically. That justice, is a proper harmony of these different parts. And when the rational part rules over the rest of the soul, and the desires are obedient to the rational part, that's the just person. So, really, I mean, I don't know if it's a great definition, but what we get is this incredible theory of human nature, and that human beings are divided up into these different parts, and that these different parts, crucially, are meant to be in a certain relation with each other. And the most important thing is the rational or thinking part rules over the rest of us. So when we get to Book 5, all this has sort of been laid out. And um, Book five is quite interesting because the first part of it is returning to the structure of this imaginary city, more of how it should be ruled, or what its laws should be, or what its customs should be. And then it takes a very interesting turn. And that interesting turn is, let's see, um, I want to get it exactly right because it's so important. Sorry, it must be further in. Yeah, it's just on this. I don't know what page it is, but it's at 472 in the margin. That's always the same. The Stephanus numbers in the margin. Where it's Glaucon who says, "Well, yes, yes, all of this is great. This imaginary city is great, but um, how could we ever bring it into being? How could it ever become a reality?" And Socrates reminds Glaucon that that's not the point. That they didn't create the city to make it a reality. They created a city to make it the most just city. Um, but Socrates indulges Glaucon and says something that is quite shocking, really, to Glaucon and the rest of them. Um, and that's here. When Socrates says, well, this is near 474, until philosophers rule as kings in their cities, or those who are nowadays called kings and leading men become genuine and adequate philosophers, so that political power and philosophy become thoroughly blended together, while the numerous natures that now pursue either one exclusively or forcibly prevented from doing so, cities will have no rest from evils, my dear Glaucon. Basically saying the only way that any of this would actually come into being for real is if philosophers were kings, if the philosophers were the rulers. And therefore, we kind of get a more specific definition of who these guardians are. They're philosophers, which makes plenty of sense, really, because they are the rational people, the thinking people. So then we might ask, what is going on? Socrates says the guardians, the philosophers who are philosophers, deserve to rule over everyone else. And the connected claim is that the rational part, the part of the soul that corresponds to the philosopher guardians, deserves to rule over the rest of the self. Um, that is not so clear, is it? That is, it's not clear that this definition of justice, of being just, is really either true, or remember, the next question really is whether the just life is better than the unjust life, which basically means how is a human being going to be happy and fulfilled? And Socrates has basically said when they are reasonable, when they are rational, when the rational part rules over the rest of them. And that is, on the face of it, quite questionable.